Hello, my name is Deven Berryhill, and welcome to Creatives Who Thrive. This is the podcast and vlog that talks with creative people and tells their stories of how they've been able to monetize their art in a way to continue creating good art. And that's really the vision of this program. This is our first episode, and we're glad you're here. Today, I'm really excited to have our first guest. He's somewhat responsible for me starting this podcast. His name is Brian Nixon. He is a musician, guitarist, keyboard, singer, songwriter. He's a poet. He's a painter. He's a writer. He's got a number of books out, but really gives some stories and some insights for you on how you can apply some of the basic principles that Brian and others have applied that have helped them become creatives who can thrive in this world. But first, I want to tell you about a special guitar amplifier company called Risson Guitar Amps. There was a guy named Bob Rizzi who developed Risson Amplifiers back in the 1960s. But before that, he worked for a guy named Leo Fender in Fullerton, California. Leo, along with Bob, George Fullerton, and many others, developed some of the more classic amps that we know today. When Leo Fender sold Fender guitars and amplifiers to CBS, Bob went to go work for Rickenbacker. He developed amps that even Led Zeppelin used on their first tour here in the United States. There's been many musicians that have played on the Risson amplifiers, including Joe Walsh, Slash from Guns N' Roses, Glenn Campbell, and now the Tourmaliners. We're excited that we're going to be coming out with this year in 2021 into 2022, the new Surfmaster. And check out their website. Go to RissonAmplifiers.com. So I want to welcome today my guest and good friend, Brian Nixon. Welcome to Creatives Who Thrive.
Deven, it's so great to be with you. And I must admit, I'm stoked that you have taken this step to create a wonderful podcast and vlog and, focusing on creativity. So I just commend you, and I'm really excited to see how this will take shape and where it will take you from here.
Yeah, well, this is an awesome opportunity for us to just chat as friends. I've known Brian for probably the better part of 20 years now. We worked together in education. Actually, you were my boss for a season. And we worked together in a couple different schools. But one of the things we do have in common is that your in-laws are actually really good friends with my parents.
That's exactly right. They went to high school together.
That's right. Tell us where you're located now and what you do.
Well, currently I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am a director of publishing and education here in Albuquerque, but originally born in California, born in Southern California, LA County, but lived a good portion of my older years in San Jose, California. So both Southern and Northern California.
Yeah. And we've been out to visit you a couple times out there in New Mexico, and one of my favorite Mexican food places, Sardi's. The queso at Sardi's is feared.
There's so many great restaurants here in New Mexico. It's unbelievable.
Hey, what I want to do is kind of get your story a little bit. Give us your background, your creative background. What inspired you to start creating as a young person?
Yeah, well, really, I think when you sent me these questions, Deven, there were three things. Number one, my family. Both my mom and dad were singers. They were music. And so I was engulfed, surrounded by music. But the second thing is, in my early childhood, elementary and junior high years, I actually grew up here in New Mexico after my parents left California, then a short stop in Tucson, and then here in New Mexico. And here I was also surrounded by creativity. I mean, art is everywhere here in New Mexico. But then the third thing I would say was just books. It was reading. It was engaging myself with different thinkers, different writers. And all of that really, I think, helped frame and shape my yearning to not only write, but create music, later, paint. So the whole creative aspect, I think the seeds were planted in my early childhood days.
Going back to high school, I mean, like a lot of kids in Southern California picked up a guitar, maybe wanted to be a band. This is back in the 80s, right? So we're dating ourselves here a little bit, but tell us about you. You got together with some friends and formed a band that was actually a signed band and had some relative success.
Well, let me back up just a little bit because it's a crazy story. So when we moved from New Mexico back to California, we landed in San Jose, California, and I was new. You know, I was the new kid in at the high school there. But if you will, I had longer hair. You could tell I was into modern rock and that type of thing. So this fella came up to me, Yugomir Kristolonich, known as Yogi, well-known LA session guitarist. At the time he was living in San Jose. He comes up to me and says, "Hey, you look like you could play instruments. I'm looking for people to jam with." And I lied. Yogi, I'm sorry to this day, but I go, yeah, I play keyboard. And he goes, "Great. Well, next week, let's get together at my house and I'm going to, we're going to jam." So what I did is I went home on my old Hammond keyboard that was my grandmother's. I pulled out some music theory books and tried to figure out at least some basic chords. Fast forward a week, I show up at Yogi's house and he realized very quickly that I wasn't a skilled, seasoned musician. But what I love about Yogi, he said, "You know what I would recommend, I know you have a passion for it, why don't you just start learning music theory?" So I literally became a music theory geek, and I spent hours upon hours after I got out of school just teaching myself music. And then, of course, I took some classes. So Yogi was my first person. Yogi, of course, went on to play with Buck Cherry. He was the guitarist in Buck Cherry. He was Chris Cornell's main guitarist. He played with the Wallflowers. The list goes on and on. Yogi is a very well-known, established session, LA session guitarist. But after that, because my interests were in modern rock or indie rock or post-punk, I connected with some other friends at the school, a fellow by the name of Jeff Giesick. And he said, "Let's start a band." So we started a band. We got some other friends from a sister high school called Piedmont. I went to Independence High School. And there we formed, initially called Morning Becomes Electra, after the Eugene O'Neill play. So Eugene O'Neill was he actually died in the Bay Area. He wasn't originally from the Bay Area, but we named our group after a playwright, an American playwright. And we just kind of started to expand and explore different things. And at the time we were doing post-punk, kind of goth, if you will. I was the only non-goth guy, but they were all into goth. Then the band split up and a few of us went one direction. The other guys kind of stayed in the goth genre. And it was with, as you mentioned, the Electra. We added a new member. His name was Chris Manick. Today he's known as Peanut Butter Wolf, the owner of Stones Throw Record. But what we did is we took kind of the punk ethic with hip hop and we combined the two in the mid 80s, which, as you know, Deven, was way ahead of the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I really attribute that confluence to Chris Manick because he was a DJ and he really loved, Motown, hip hop, and he brought that world to what we were doing. And then it took the notice of a local indie label and they signed us. And then we put out one album before Chris left with Hollywood Records and then later founded Stones Throw. And then I left later to pursue more education. So that was the early 80s connection there.
Yeah. And then after Electra, you had a couple groups too. I was looking at your bio. You had a group called Canterbury and then another group called Widow's Might that was actually, you guys were on Hope Records, which was, I found interesting, Rick Wakeman from the band Yes, who did the song Roundabout, with the famous keyboard solo. He's an amazing keyboard player. He developed that label and helped you guys launch that album. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
So Canterbury was after I was in college. I had transferred to a new college and Canterbury was essentially my college band. And I would easily put us in the folk rock category that leaned maybe a little bit of world music at times. Canterbury won, believe it or not, the best Bay Area band in a showcase. And we were getting a little traction. And then I think we just burnt ourselves out. We put out a couple of CDs and, did some small, TV gig type things. But then Widow's Mite really started to form at the end of Canterbury. 3 of the members of Canterbury later helped form Widow's Mite. But there was a fan, his name was Nick Cachopo. He was a fan of Canterbury. He was also a Yes fanatic. And he knew that Rick Wakeman was starting a new label there in England. And he sent some Canterbury music to Rick Wakeman. Rick Wakeman was intrigued, but by that time, Canterbury was folding and Widow's Mite was just beginning. So by the time we got wind of Rick Wakeman's interest, we were Widow's Mite by that time. So we met when Rick Wakeman was doing a tour here in America. We went down to Newport Beach at some, Swath Hotel there, some really nice hotel, and met him. And he talked with us, and he sent us a contract. One of our members flew to England, and his name was Jarrett Petro. He flew to England and signed and represented us. And we put out one album with Hope Records called The Garden Rises Up. So that was fun as well.
Yeah. I'd actually seen that album. Probably somewhere in the mid-90s, early 90s.
Totally. You were exactly right. It was mid-90s. And by that time, we had Canterbury, like I said, was folk rock. Widow's Mite started, if you will, went more mainstream rock. But, we had a fun time because at the time in California, there were a lot of, bands, I guess, doing what we were doing. And we were able to, if you will, play with some up and coming bands, Switchfoot probably being one of the most notable. They were a SoCal band, and we played a few gigs with them. And I remember going, man, these guys are good. They're going to probably go somewhere. And of course they went somewhere.
Sure.
But Deven, at the time I had so many interests, education, music, art, and I obviously didn't stick to the music thing solely because my interests were all over the place. So when Widow's Mite finally folded, I just continued to pursue other creative outlets, that still go on to this day.
You're someone I know that is you're part of so many different disciplines, author, musician, painter. You're even like a film director. I've known you to be a TV and radio show host. I mean, you've done, like, you do one album here and then another 1 or 2 albums over here, or this project over there. So you aren't just a singular guy. I mean, you've spread that out. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just, how my brain works. The creativity, I want to be creative in different fields, but I'm also one of those guys that are, eternally curious. So, I want to pursue, poetry or learn about poets, or I want to pursue writers. I want to do music. Music obviously has been something in my blood since I was younger. So it's always going to be there with me. But interestingly enough, I find other disciplines help, not only instigate, but help flourish in these other fields. So, back in high school, when I started to paint, I found that, the painting really gave me more visual aesthetic, if you will, for music. And then when I got into poetry, I found that helped with lyric songwriting. And so all of these disciplines really helped frame, what I was doing creatively. So, I still paint to this day, as you've mentioned. I've been published in poetry, but I think all of that just comes from a general yearning to be creative and to be curious about a host of things.
Yeah, that's something I want to develop a little bit later in the show here today, if we have time. Is that idea of doing multiple disciplines versus putting kind of all your chips, if you will, on one number and hoping somehow you make it thing. In being a creative, it's not about necessarily being a star.
Right.
I think there's that perception out there that, especially in the kind of American Idol, the kind of culture we've had, particularly here in the United States for the last, 10 or 15 years now, we've lived through that. And it's like, there's been this kind of cultural creative shift that's the pinnacle of success right there, is to be the rock star or be the American Idol star now. Take rock the style out of it, take the concept of rock star, of that lifestyle, and that's the end all be all of what a creative is. And that's, as you and I know, that only happens to 0.001% of the population, and it's really not a sustainable thing. I mean, my own father's history. He was in the band the Safaris, right, who wrote the song Wipeout. Well, I know firsthand, watching somebody and living, obviously being raised by someone who experienced extreme stardom at 15 years old.
Right.
And the benefits of that definitely was a life-changing experience, but there's also another side to that coin that's kind of like, well, what have you done next? How do you live up to that? Once you've had the hit song, if you will, because now you've set the standard that's so high. You go on American Idol, how many American Idol season winners can you name? Can you name 5 right now?
I can't. I think I can name one. Carrie Underwood win.
Right, that's what everybody says. And Kelly Clarkson.
I remember.
And that's about it. And they were huge. I mean, at one time, but now you don't even know who they are. And so I think part of this creatives who thrive concept is really about being a creative for your life. It's what you do, and do it in a way that's healthy and sustainable. And you want it to build. I mean, particularly if your goals are to do it for full time, or maybe even as a side hustle. I think true creatives can't not create. They're always creating, whether they almost kind of like to or not, because that's who they are. That's just their personality. That's how they were made to be. So I want to shift gears here a little bit. So at what point did you start deriving an income from your creative work, and how did that come about?
Well, I've been fortunate enough, Deven, as you know, to be hired, if you will, as creative. And I've worked in the private Christian industry, in that I've been a publisher, I've been an editor. And so after I left education, or transitioned or expanded education, my education background, I was brought in to edit books, to create books. And so I'm one of those, as I said, a very fortunate one to be able to have a creative outlet, to be paid for my creativity. Mm-hmm. But on a personal side, you alluded to this earlier in the broadcast, is that I've had to go outside of just one field. I've expanded to a whole host of areas. Mm-hmm. So, I've had to publish books. I've had to continue to write music. I continue to write poetry, send those in. And if you know poetry, you make no or very little money of poetry. Really, it's just a labor of love. I mean, maybe some poet laureates are able to go out there and live off their poetry, but most people have a teaching gig or something else of that nature. Sure. But I've had to expand my base and really put irons in different fires to see what takes. And let's be honest, creative outlets, particularly in today's world, where everyone wants something for free. Why would I pay for this song when I could just download it for free on the internet? It's difficult for creatives. So I think you really do have to broaden your base. Go back to a point, Deven, when you and I back in the 80s, and I always heard this from people, if anyone was interested in becoming a musician, they said, learn all the different styles, learn all the different genres of music. And you're like, well, why? Man, I'm a punk rock dude. That's all I want to do is I want to do punk rock. And they're going, well, no, because if you want to make a living in music, you've got to learn jazz. You've got to learn, pop standards. You've got to learn all this, because chances are you're not that 0.001% that you mentioned, Deven. You're probably the other people that will have to do session work. You'll have to, you have to do these side hustles.
Yeah.
So I didn't do that necessarily in music, but I use that concept in a variety of creative outlets. So, you make some money in book publishing, you make some money with your music, you make some money in all these other endeavors. But like I said, I've been very fortunate in that I've been hired as a creative in my field.
Do you find that because you've kind of cast your net, or that it kind of takes pressure off one discipline versus another in terms of having to kind of make money in order, off this one particular discipline?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think for me, it probably does. But as I said, that's also how I'm wired. I'm just wired to want to tackle different areas and different subjects. But I do think, and for me, it also maybe helps alleviate some of the routine or boredom. That's probably too strong of a word. But, after a while, if you've been writing multiple songs, then you go, I'm going to go write a poem, or I'm going to go paint. Now I'm a very disciplined person, so I paint every week and I write music every week, and that's just part of my weekly discipline, which I think is incredibly important for creatives. Don't wait for that moment of inspiration. Put your seat in the chair and get to work. But I do think, when you're trying or you're investing in different areas, sometimes something will rise up, other times it will remain flat, but you're still pursuing creativity, to the best of your ability. And in some cases you make some money off of it, in the case of maybe a song or a book deal. Other times, you're just doing it because you love it.
No, that's good. That's really wise. And I think for our listeners, creatives, who are, coming up the ranks, we've all had to work those extra jobs,
Right.
There is this kind of thought that is propagated out there that, good art is created by the artist who is struggling out there,
Right.
and what we call kind of the starving artist, right?
Right.
And they're the only ones who really make real art because they're hardcore and they live it. And
Right.
and I'm not totally sure that that's correct. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think if you look at the history of art and creativity, you do find both fields. That person. Let's use Van Gogh as the example. He was studying to be a minister. He wanted to be a minister pastor, and that didn't take off for him. So he turned to painting relatively late in life, and was that consummate bohemian, starving artist, lived off the good graces of his brother Theo, and died in abject poverty, as an artist. But of course, after he died, went on to influence, a whole host of post-impressionistic artists. So you have someone like that. But on the other hand, you go back a little bit further, you had someone like Michelangelo, or who had patrons. He was paid in the case by, be it the Medici family or popes, he was paid to do what he did as an artist. So his income, if you will, was as an artist. And so I think throughout history, you do find both. And a lot of times it really is hard to determine, your own personal pilgrimage, how your course is going to take. But I think what it does require is, again, I'm harping on this, but it requires discipline. It requires sometimes just being at the right place at the right time, saying something new and fresh in a unique way. And all of these things, they confluence together, and voila, there you are. So let's go back as an example. So Deven, you and I, of course, we grew up in the 80s. We were doing our rock thing in the 80s. And the big bands of the 80s, you could list them all. But one of the big ones was U2. You and I both are fans of U2. And they were really represent, particularly that mid 80s. Well, then all of a sudden, this scrawny blonde-haired guy, who happened to be a really talented guy, wore thrift store sweaters, And he started, doing music, what we now know as grunge. Well, he brought something new. He had a distinct voice in there, and then bada boom, Nirvana, and then the whole grunge movement, started. And guys like you and I were going, oh my goodness, this is a change in musical direction. So someone like Kurt Cobain, he did bring something new, and he was dedicated. He was a great songwriter, and all of these other factors that went in, and he was, if you will, at the right place at the right time. Seattle, which was kind of grooming this grunge sound, and he was able to, progress, take the sound to the bank. Whereas guys like you and I, who were, slaving away in the 80s and maybe doing our own thing, we weren't in Seattle, we weren't Kurt Cobain, and also, we weren't creating that new style. We weren't on the cusp of that, but he was, and so he reaped the benefits of it.
I like what you said about how, he was in Seattle. And, interestingly enough, I did my undergraduate work at Seattle Pacific University in 89 and 90.
You were right there
when Soundgarden and Nirvana and what was the band before Pearl Jam, Mud Honey or something like that.
Right.
They were playing in local bars and little local clubs when we were there. But the label that was there was Sub Pop. That was the big label, and the community part of it was very important, because if you listen to the production values, even the song, you could tell the songwriting, that they would even have these certain little licks that they would play on the guitar that everybody had the da na na na, and then the remember the little would come in. It seemed like Soundgarden had the little thing on the guitar, and then Nirvana would do song, and it had the same in Smells Like Teen Spirit. It seems like every band. There was another band called Voivod, and these other, everybody had that little, every Sub Pop band had that little lick in there. And it was like a signature little thing that said, we're from Seattle. We're, of course, everybody was in drop D. A lot of people played drop D, and they had kind of, they'd taken out a lot of the delays and overproduction and brought back kind of rock and roll, really, which was cool. That kind of Hendrix, almost less produced guitar, kind of the Hendrix, Neil Young, kind of, that earlier rock and roll, 70s rock, really a lot of feel. But I guess my point is that the community part of it, though, everybody was collaborating off one another.
Totally.
And that, I think that's it. Don't you think that's something that's super important, is to be a part of a scene?
No question.
Happening.
You nailed some key concepts. Collaboration. It's funny, even to this day in my creative output, I always love to collaborate. I love to hear what other people have. It's kind of a myth of this lone ranger or lone wolf genius. I mean, you go back to someone like, Lennon and McCartney. They had each other, but they were obviously collaborating as their competition against the Beach Boys. There was this competitive collaboration type things as well. And so the collaboration is important, but also the scene, joining a scene, making sure you're part of wherever you're at, that creative culture. And going back to my own story, in San Jose at the time, I made sure that we were part of, this creative scene. On some cases, it was with the artists, visual artists, but on other times it was with the musicians. And you want to collaborate, and you want to keep all of these dialogues happening between these cross disciplines. So I completely agree. Collaborate, join a scene, find ways to be mentored by other people. You may be a young musician or a young artist or a young writer, and you're going, you know what, I'm just going to go talk to this guy, and if he's not a jerk to me and may give me some tips or helpful hints, that would be a good thing too. So all of those are important factors in helping hone your craft.
Yeah, I like all that stuff is good. I like what you were saying. Another point was I want to develop that a little bit too, is having a mentor.
Right.
I always like to play in bands that I knew had better musicians than me.
Right.
I always wanted to be around the band director. Like when I was in school in junior high, I had an awesome band director, a guy named Pete Jacobs, who was a phenomenal musician. He could play every instrument, literally any instrument, woodwinds, brass, piano, guitar, bass, drum. And he was the band director of my school. But before he was the band director, I mean, he was a published songwriter. He had the group Children of the Day back in the 70s. But, you know, he later went on to, you know, last time I talked to him, he was writing charts for Brian Setzer Orchestra, you know?
Yeah.
You know, and you're like, wow, this guy is amazing, you know? And so he was one of my mentors. Was there a mentor in your life that really kind of helped you in one particular discipline or another?
Yeah, well, as I said, interestingly enough, Yogi Lanich, again, early on, he's the initial guy that challenged me and said, hey, you need to start learning theory. But I think later on, a lot of my mentors in high school, later high school, were either visual artists, you know, people who kind of saw what I was doing and said, you know, you should pursue that a little bit more. And then, of course, in early college, interestingly enough, a lot of the mentors were both in the visual arts, but also in music. There was a professor of mine, his name was Robert Danziger, and I was a music minor in college. I couldn't decide between music or art. And the music professors were going, no, do music. I mean, do art. And then the music guys were going, no, do music. Well, I did my minor in music. So Robert Danziger, you know, he was a classical musician, but he always was encouraging to me and saying, you know what, you don't have to be a classical musician, just do what you do. And at the time I was in Canterbury, and just do it well and be creative and follow that path. And so there were people along the way that really did encourage, you know, my artistic creative outlets, let alone your own family, be it your parents. I got married in college, my wife, Melanie, all of these individuals, you know, did help, you know, I guess, light the match that, you know, that kept the candle ignited.
Get back a little bit to the monetization side a little bit, because I know a lot of our listeners are probably someone who has a group or music or creates something, maybe a podcast of their own, or maybe they're a filmmaker. Like my daughter, she's in the film department in university right now, and you know, I see some of her friends, and they're all trying to get the big thing is to get their movie or their short film on Netflix, right? It's almost kind of like the new Spotify for, you know, for film and television, that kind of thing. Are there any specific things that you're doing that seem to be really working as it pertains to monetizing your creative work? Like, are there any media platforms, communication styles, networks, approaches, principles that you see out there that are currently happening that you think are really groundbreaking and could be helpful to someone watching today?
Well, you just mentioned, you know, several. I think, you know, most people, unlike when you and I were growing up, you know, social media really wasn't there. We had to hustle. We had to, you know, get a cassette tape in front of people and so on and so forth. But I think today, in some ways, it's become easier to get your music out there to a broader thing, or your art or your movies, because the internet, what we're doing, you know, you're in California, I'm in New Mexico, and here we are doing it. So on one level, it's easier, but on another level, it's harder. And that is because there's so much creativity. There's
Mm.
so much media out there. How do you rise to the top? What do you do? And so I really do think you need to collaborate. You may not be the social media guru, but you need to find someone who can help you in those different areas. And they know all the latest and greatest when it comes to that. So I do think finding those outlets is going to be important. And again, I don't want to list them all because we could be here all day with all the different social media outlets. But I also think, Deven, don't neglect old school ways. So if you're a writer, sure, you could self-publish, you could put something online and have a million people reading it. But on the other line, I still think there's something very, very valuable to go through, the time-tested way, to get a publisher, to get an agent, and to really invest yourself with people who know what they're doing, be it an agent or a publisher. And also, I still think, finding a publisher for writers is important, because what that's saying is that a publisher also values and sees value in what you're doing. In musical terms, it would be finding a music label, someone who says, I believe in what you're doing and I want to help you move that. Yeah. So even though modern day media really does make it easier in some ways to get it out, I still think, labels and book publishers are very healthy ways. And also, a lot of times when you do get publishers and working with an editor or a music publisher, they may go, your chorus really stinks. Could you rewrite that? Having professionals listen and critique what you're doing, and then you go back and you make it better. And so that's what good editors do. That's what good music publishers or producers do. All of these guys are the added ears and eyes that help the artists refine what they're doing to make it better. Because in the end, that's what you want to do. You want to make great art. You just don't want to make adequate art. You want to make what you're doing the best it possibly can be.
I couldn't agree more. Developing your craft.
That's exactly
beyond
right.
Just putting out something, kind of haphazardly or quickly, and you think it's amazing. Of course, you've created it, and let's say you've written a song, and it's like, wow, that's the greatest song I've ever written, I've ever heard. But until it's really making an impact, you really, you can be amazing in your own mind, as long as you want. But as a creative who has a desire to see your art be monetized so you can continue making more art, there needs to be a certain element of the actual craft itself, the work itself needs to be better, because that's ultimately what's going to sell the work. Is it any good?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I know, Deven, in today's world, there's a lot of ways to monetize. Sadly for the artists, be it, visual or whatever, they get so small percentages. If you go on Spotify, you're making half a penny or a quarter of a penny for people to download this. I mean, it's making Spotify lots of money. But, and same thing with, self-publishing on Amazon. I've heard of some people who self-publish on Amazon that really make good livings. But I myself, because I guess maybe my age, I'm old school, I still go through traditional means. So when I publish a book, I go to a book publisher, a reputable book publisher who's known in the industry, that has some clout, or at least some recognition and respect. So for my books, I go through a publisher. And with music, I would do the same thing. I would pursue a music publishing company. If you're a songwriter, or if you're a band or a singer-songwriter, try your luck at pitching yourself to a label. And if they say no and you're still passionate about it, then go independent. And that's okay. Here's another thing for artists. Don't let publishers or music labels or music publishers squelch your dream. Hone your craft, pursue on, continue to do it, and if need be, self-publish until people recognize what you're doing. Let me give you a great example from history. Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, one of the American great books of poetry. Well, he self-published it, initially, because everyone's going, what is this? This isn't poetry. Poetry comes from England, and it's by these guys who use, really fancy phrases and things. And then you have this American guy who just comes out and starts saying it in a very American way. And no one's buying it. No one's getting it. Well, of course, Leaves of Grass is considered one of the greatest American works of poetry written, but that was self-published initially. And we could do, we could do this in music as well. We could probably name hundreds of bands that no one was buying what they were, or buying into what they were doing. But then all of a sudden they go, wow, what you're doing is cutting edge. And now we're going to invest in it. But, they had put out their own demos in our days, cassette tapes, or they make something online today and send it out. And then after a while, someone takes notice of it. So don't let publishers' rejection or a music company's rejection of you stop what you're doing. You need to pursue on and discipline and get creative feedback. It'll just make you better.
Man, that's so good. That's really good. I do want you to share a bit about what you're doing now, and you've got another book coming out soon. But before you do that, I wanted to go back about the discipline part, and I don't want to miss that part. I don't want our listeners to miss the part about consistent discipline when it comes to making your art. You want to elaborate a little more on that?
Let me tell you just on the three areas that I'm invested in: music, writing, and painting. Deven, I have, and I know this sounds crazy, but I have a weekly schedule that I do those three. So I write my songs, usually Tuesday mornings, and sometimes in the evening if I'm not too tired. But Tuesday mornings, because I teach at a college in the evening, so my day starts later. So I have earmarked Tuesday mornings, and whether I feel like it or not, whether I'm inspired or not, I get in my music studio, I pick up a guitar or sit down at the keyboard and I write. And I have a little desk where I'm jotting down ideas, and then I come up with chords and I'm continually writing. And I do that as a discipline. And then for art, on my day off, I do the same thing. Whether I feel like it or not, I sit down, I either get my canvas or my watercolor paper, and I sit and I put down art. A lot of times the art comes out junky, but every now and then you get that, that moment you go, hey, that's pretty good, or that idea was good. And then writing, of course, writing is part of my job, but on a personal side, I too use days off or evenings to carve out those times, and you really have to sit down. And for writers, and I think it really applies for songwriters as well, I usually use the 3W approach. And the first W is watch. You have to be attentive to the world around you. Watch what's going on. Listen to, people's accents or what they say. And then the second W is wonder. You have to wonder about the world, and all of that helps, hone in on your craft. But then thirdly, you have to sit down and write. You actually have to put the discipline, jot down your thoughts, sit in your chair, write it out. Three of my favorite songwriters, they're all very, very disciplined. My three favorite songwriters of all time, of course, is, the Californian Tom Waits. And Tom Waits is a brilliant songwriter. And I know he takes seriously and hones in on his craft of songwriting. And of course, you have to mention Bob Dylan. He has won the Nobel Prize in literature for his works. But the guy sits down and actually writes out. It's not just a fleeting moment of inspiration. It may start there, but you have to hone that craft. But then my third favorite songwriter from our generation is a guy by the name Nick Cave. And Nick Cave is not as well known in the States. He's an Australian, but he's a brilliant songwriter. And the guy, if you ever go and read about someone who's disciplined to the craft, he will dress himself in a suit like he's going to work, and he rents a space and he goes in and he just writes, be it his movie scripts, be it his music, be it his books, and he uses it as a job because it is a job. He just doesn't wait for the muse of inspiration. He dresses up like he's going to work and he goes to work, be it his own work in his own office. But I think we have to have that kind of discipline. Sure, we could watch the world, we could hear what's going on, we could wonder and be interested in things, but there's that time when you've just got to sit down and do it.
That's so good, Brian. I appreciate you sharing that, because that is one of the things that I think plagues the artist maybe the most from making great art, is that consistent discipline.
That's right.
You know, I think we've all seen the rockumentary biopic of, the Doors, or
Right.
even the Beatles to a certain extent. We know a lot about their story. Most people do, because it's so well, published. Interviews of Paul McCartney sharing about the days in Hamburg and all that. But a lot of times these, especially pop stars or film directors like an Oliver Stone or something like that, you see them out there and it looks like they're just partying all the time.
Right.
They're on E! News or some kind of thing, or there's, like I said, the rockumentary, and all you see is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of thing. But really, when it comes down to it, you have to know that someone even like a Jim Morrison had to sit down for hours and craft lyric after lyric after lyric. It wasn't just all, peyote and pot,
Right. Let's use the Doors. I mean, obviously, we're both Doors fans. I mean, Doors were one of my seminal influences. And, Jim Morrison, obviously, his early childhood, he grew up here in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yeah.
He went, to elementary and middle school here. You could go still see the house he grew up here in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
But then, because his family was in the military, he popped around. He was in California, he was in Florida, he was in all of these different places. But what people don't realize is he was at UCLA Film School. He was getting his bachelor's degree in film, and he is honing in on an artistic craft. He was also into beat poetry. So he's listening to poems, and he considered himself first and foremost a poem. So you're exactly right. He had lyrics and poems already, worked out. So on that fateful day when he meets Ray Manzarek, so the story goes, on the beach, Ray Manzarek comes, hey, I've seen you at UCLA. What's going on? Right. And then, Jim Morrison goes, I have some lyrics. And then he starts, humming and saying some of the lyrics. And Ray Manzarek, who of course was the keyboardist for the Doors, looks at him and goes, I think this guy has something going on. And of course, the Doors are formed. So Jim Morrison did have lyrics. He had given great thought. He went to school. He got his bachelor's degree. Ray Manzarek also was a schooled guy, and he had spent many years in bands and performing. All of these guys were schooled and spent years honing their crafts before they had their big break. And even the Beatles, even though the Beatles didn't go off, let's say, and get their degrees like the Doors did, the Beatles honed their craft in Germany, playing nightclubs and bars and so on and so forth, night after night after night. So they learned through experience what people liked and what people were listening to. They were attuned to what was coming out of America, being at the Beach Boys or Buddy Holly or whatever. And all of these guys were influenced on the Beatles. So they too also honed their craft. It just wasn't an overnight thing for them.
Yeah, and that's a trapping, definitely, that concept that, it just happened.
Right.
Creatives can get kind of pulled into the, hey, I'm just going to go out and be the bohemian lifestyle, and then it's going to happen. And that's really Hollywood. There's all these perceptions. I mean, even on these singing shows, they're creating the story and the drama and everything else. And those are fake. A lot of them. I mean, some of them are really good.
Plastic. And here's the thing, art is more than surface deep. And I don't care what art you're doing. There's theological ideas, there's philosophical ideas, there's ideas about life. And so there's a depth to true art. And in the plastic culture, and what, be it Hollywood or whoever's trying to create, they may be a flash in the pan. They may have their 15 minutes of fame, to quote Andy Warhol, but they will fade. I think art, true artists, it's a lifelong investment. It's a lifelong endeavor. You are a creative person, and you want to do it for life. Whether people are listening to what you're doing, whether they're buying what you're doing it because it's who you are and what you're passionate about.
We're kind of winding things down a little bit on our time, but I did want to have you just share a bit So what are you doing now? I mean, you came out with a book called Tilt. What was it, last year? You've got
Yep.
a new book out. Tell it, maybe some other music, poetry. What are you currently doing? What you got coming out soon?
Well, Tilt, as you said, Tilt came out last year. I do have the copy here in front of me. My new book will be published by Whiff and Stock Publishers, the same folks that did Tilt, and it's called Beauty and the Banana, and it deals with theopoetics. And theopoetics is the convergence of theology with the arts, and in this case, poetry and such. And I look at the history and impact of what beauty is, and it's a little bit more philosophical, but it's supposedly coming out this summer with Whiff and Stock. I have 3 musical projects going on. Believe it or not, Canterbury, who we've already talked about, our 30th anniversary is around the corner. So
Wow.
Eli Aragati, we were the 2 main songwriters. We are collaborating on a new CD project. And then here locally, I'm working with a local producer, just writing songs, and we've been recording those as well. And then Widow's Mite, who you mentioned, our 25th anniversary is around the corner. So we're also thinking of recording and doing some songs to celebrate that as well. But in addition to that, I'm still doing my poetry and I'm still painting. So I've submitted some poetry to the Penwood Review, which is a poetry review which I enjoy, and they've published me in the past. And of course, I'm continually doing my painting. So I have a very full creative plate.
Yeah, I was looking in your bio too. In 2014, you were nominated for a gospel music awards by the New Mexico Music Awards. How'd that come about?
Yeah. Well, okay. So the producer I'm working with now here in New Mexico, he and I have collaborated on things in the past. And so a local radio station here, at the time they were M88, now they're called Star 88, but they were doing a little kind of fundraiser, and they said, hey, would you consider, writing a song in your old goth style? So myself and this producer, his name's Kenny Riley. He runs Rio Grande Studios.
Oh, I know Ken.
Yeah, you know Ken Riley. And we produced the song in a goth style, and it got on regular rotation here in New Mexico on the radio station. It's a song called To the End, and it got some recognition. It was nominated for the best New Mexico gospel. And then a little bit later, I was working with another fella in the jazz idiom, and it too was nominated for a New Mexico Music Awards for it's called Bolero de Burque, and it too was nominated. So it's just one of those things, creative people, you create, and you usually do it just for yourself because that's who you are. And then if other people take notice, that's kind of an added bonus. But yeah, the group that we founded was called Beautiful Gallows, and the song's called To the End, and I think people could find it online. But it was a fun little project, and it's definitely within your, what I would call cathedral goth realm. I'm singing in the very low register. It's in your face, rock guitar, but it's really fun.
Well, anytime you get Ken Riley involved, there's going to be in your face rock guitar.
Yeah, and
No
there is. And what's interesting with the newer projects right now, they're more pop, what I call California jingle jangle, sounds. But we're having a fun time with it.
I'm going to have you send me a lot of those links. And we're going to have in the show notes here in the comments section, we're going to have links to your new book that you came out with, Tilt. And if you can give me some of those other links, we'll put those in the show notes of some of your music. That way our listeners can go back if they want to know a little bit more about your catalog and your creative work and support that work as well. And I'm hoping, maybe you'll come back when the new book comes out and share on that. But 2 things I want to do before we go. One, I wanted you to give us a little sample from the Tilt. You were going to read a little poem from the Tilt book. But before you do that, we're going to close the show with that. But before you do that, if you were to go back, and I'm going to ask this of all of our guests that we have, go back to your 20-year-old self, 1980 something.
Yeah.
what would you tell that person, a little word of wisdom in terms of your creative future? What would you say to that person?
I love this
To
question.
you?
And actually, of all your questions you sent, this is the one that like really, I had to really think about. And what I came up with is just believe in yourself. Believe in your ability, and what you are expressing and what you have to say is unique. And let that belief lead you to action. That belief in wow, I could do this, and I'm passionate about it, and lead it to action. And I just want to underscore what you said earlier, Deven, is you don't have to be a big famous person, but you have to follow that passion and believe in what you're doing enough so you make it a lifelong pursuit. Creativity is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so many people see it as a sprint. I'm just going to get famous and then that's it. But true creativity is a marathon. It's a lifelong pursuit of discovery, of learning, of creative outlets. So believe in yourself enough and support what you're doing, and get people around and mentors so you can make it a lifelong pursuit. You can make it a lifelong action. So I think for me, it's just belief.
Wow, that's so good. So good. Well, hopefully that inspires some of our viewers and listeners on the podcast today. If they wanted to get a hold of you, Brian, if they wanted to connect with you, is there like a website they can go to, or even if they wanted to email you, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, I used to have all of that stuff. I used to have the website and everything else of that nature. Probably, honestly, the easiest way to get hold of me now is through Facebook. I resisted Facebook, Deven, for years, but a year ago, the publisher said, "Welcome to Facebook.
Right.
You've got to get on some of this social media." So I think Brian Charles Nixon is how you would find me on Facebook.
Yeah.
And that's the best way to get hold of me. I used to have a Twitter account. I think I dismantled it. I used to have an Instagram account. I've dismantled it recently. I'll probably pick it up again. But the best way right now is just through Facebook, Brian Charles Nixon, and you could find me there.
Yeah, and you have great content. I follow you, and you've got a series of you'll do 4 or 5 different artists. Maybe it's their birthdays today or something
That's
significant
exactly right.
they did of work. Very interesting. So wonderful. Thanks again, Brian, and just the wealth of experience and knowledge you brought to today's show. But love to hear some of your poetry. So we'll close out with Brian Nixon from his book here, Tilt.
Yeah, and this poem is called "A Culture to Itself." It's based on a true story of a barber shop in Modesto, California, and I used to go there because it was cheap. And these two guys, Paul and Jay, were characters, and so it inspired this poem, which, as you said, is in the book Tilt, which it kind of deals in theopoetics. So here it is: A Culture to Itself. Paul will drift away as he stands with hair remnants around. It's amazing to see. Scissors, comb, and razor. His eyes shut as he leans forward just enough for the head of a voice to act as a pillar for REM. His quiet life and ties somehow intertwine. Jay can cut 2 to Paul's 1. He will converse in the language all his own. He speaks of private investigators and the dead with new hair. I've seen him almost butcher a man. More blood on the razor than a surgery table. Escalon, where dairy was his childhood, sleeps well with him. Together they are a business of being, a history all their own. Many will come and provide appendages to their pages of stories. For $3.50, a bargain of life is dished in a historical ray. Pictures hang as sand on the wall. No names, just faces with hours of words. Together we sit. I wonder if Mr. McHenry ever pondered the life that would happen on a street named after him. In a barbershop where teacher and hobo, minister and taxi driver converged to smell the same talc powder and touch the moment where something but silence exists for the day. That's A Culture to Itself in the book Tilt. And Deven, I just want to thank you for having me on the inaugural Creatives Who Thrive. And I just wish you the best of luck, blessings upon this. I support you 100%, and I'm thrilled for everyone who comes after to really be inspired and learn from, creative individuals. So keep it up, Deven. I'm stoked for you.
Well, right on, man. Well, you're partially responsible for this, so I'm going to give that back to you. Thank you for being a good friend and just a fellow creative. And our hope is that those of you who are listening or watching this podcast vlog, that you're able to take something from this and enrich your life with it, and it would help you in your creative endeavors to continue creating more art. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you guys next week as we move on with Creatives Who Thrive.